Zoom record. There we go. We are recording this. I'll send the link out to the recording in case you want to listen to it again. You are also welcome to share that link with all your friends and family so that you can help educate everybody about what the legislative asks are for in this year's General Assembly. I'll ask you to please use the Q&A function. You just hold your mouse down towards the bottom. You'll see those little Q&A boxes. I'll be moderating that as we go through. So we may not answer your question right that second. We'll probably wait till the end. We've got approximately 40 minutes worth of content, so there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I'll just also ask if there are any technical difficulties, if by chance the audio goes out or the video stops working or something along those lines, please let us know, but do that in the chat feature. So I'll sort of keep an eye out on that just for any emergencies. So with that, let me just open up our first poll. And I hope you can see this. It's asking, well, what is it doing in your in your neck of the woods? Just curious. Okay. So far, it looks like we've got people are coming in about all right. 95% of you have voted. So it looks like it's raining where most of you are. So yeah, we've got that wintry, and I'm in Fredericksburg. We got that sort of wintry mix that my dog hates. It's like part snow, part rain, part sleet, part freezing rain. It's a mess. So that I will close this now. There we go. Well, let me introduce you to our speaker today. In some ways, she needs no introduction. Peggy's been with CBF for 10 years. Fun fact, we started on the same day. Prior to becoming our Virginia State Director, she was CBF Senior Attorney and the Assistant Director for the Virginia office. Gosh, she's a brilliant lawyer. She's a skilled negotiator. She is a consensus builder. And I'll just say, if you've ever been walking the halls of the General Assembly and you've sat in a committee meeting, you will frequently hear legislators seek out her counsel during committee meetings. More than once, I've heard from the dais, well, what does Peggy Sanner have to say about this bill? Her succinct and thoughtful responses are on the fly, and they are legendary, at least within the halls of CBF. So you are in excellent hands for the next 40 minutes or so. And Peggy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. And let's see, I'm going to get rid of the poll. Okay. So I appreciate those kind words from Ann Jerzyk, and even more than that, I appreciate the fact that you are all here expressing your interest in what is going on with the Bay, how that relates to what will be happening in the General Assembly session beginning soon. And I'd like to spend a minute or two just getting oriented. Forget the sleet, forget the wintry mix, focus on first, our beautiful General Assembly building, our beautiful Capitol in Richmond on a sunny day. But then I'd also ask you to think about the Bay watershed to orient ourselves. We are speaking about an area that ranges from the brook streams in our mountainous west, shaded by leafy forests. We are talking about that region and all the regions between there and the tidal waters on our eastern coastal regions, the Bay and the Eastern Shore. This is a huge expanse, extremely diverse expanse. And Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been working within that expanse, of course, in Virginia and similar regions across the watershed for more than half a century. We have certainly been part of, we like to think that at least in some ways we've led an effort to restore the Chesapeake Bay. a national treasure, as you all know, on which the health and well-being of some 20 million people depend, along with at least 3,000 species of animals and plants. We try always to ensure our conclusions rest on a sound foundation of science, and that they take into account not just the waters of the bay, as you see them here, but also on the health of our local waterways, which feed into the bay. We do this in a variety of ways. We educate thousands of people every year. We advocate for what is to us plainly better policy with respect to bay and water quality issues. We work with our government and polluters where possible, holding both them, to the extent we can, accountable, as well as ourselves. And we perform with you hands-on restoration in some of our most endangered and precious areas. The Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint is, some would say, the heart of what we're doing right now. It establishes goals and it guides actions that we in Virginia are taking, along with our counterparts in other Bay states, to restore the Bay, and to do so, to get all of the policies and all the practices on the ground and fully in implementation mode by 2025, a very strict deadline, which is just around the corner. The blueprint has been a pretty nimble framework for these actions. It addresses directly many of the challenges facing the Bay, but it also has allowed us to mark up some important successes. Under the Chesapeake Bay Blueprint, which builds on efforts for the last several decades, we, the residents and people who live in this large watershed, have been able to reduce the annual input to the annual load of pollutants to the Bay by almost half. That's an extraordinary achievement. It's an extraordinary achievement that has put the spotlight of many in the world on the Chesapeake Bay work. It's not been easy, despite the success that we have seen so far, and it's also not finished. Climate change is exacerbating the challenges that we once knew. Polluted runoff from our developed areas, air pollution, industrial contaminants, all of these remain serious challenges that we and the partners that we work with need to address. But I will tell you, none of us has given up, despite the fact that the target date, 2025, is just around the corner. We're feeling pretty optimistic about the possibility of achieving a restored Bay. So let's quickly go to the heart of the matter, which is many of you will recognize. This is the House of Delegates chamber in our beautiful, our historic capital. It's an historic place, and we like to think that the particular day that's depicted here, one a few years ago when legislators in the House and in the Senate at the same time were kind enough to recognize the work of Bay restoration, asking us to represent all of you in that effort. They commended this work, they commended the Bay Foundation and its many members and supporters for the progress that we've been making. So this is where we are looking to focus, whether it's done in person or virtually, as we do in 2020. And I want to start off by talking about three areas within the state budget that we will be addressing and working with legislators to also address for the goal of achieving Bay restoration. Three programs are listed here, each one tackling a different area, a different, as we call it, source sector of Bay pollution. Three different ways that major pollution can get to the Bay. The first addresses pollution from polluted runoff from stormwater. The state has inaugurated a program 5 or 6 years ago called the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, provides matching grants to localities to help them put good pollution reducing projects on the ground with respect to stormwater and flooding. We have calculated, based on our past record, how much it costs using this program to reduce 1 pound of pollution to the Bay and taking that number and applying it to how many pounds we have to go, we have concluded in that historically grounded way that about $80 million are needed this year to achieve our goal. That's $80 million in new money. It's a serious amount of money. We'll talk about what it does in a moment. The second major area for the budget is to continue and expand on a really successful program that Virginia has been funding for upwards of 20 years, and that's to modernize the wastewater treatment plants across the state. This modernization process yields certain pollution limits. It addresses what had been one of the most noxious areas of pollution that fouled many of our waterways, and it's led to really important improvements that you can see with your own eyes and, if you will, smell with your own nose. To continue that work, calculated in a similar way based on past successes, we think and have calculated $55 million in new money will be required. And finally, on this list, we're asking our General Assembly to heed the advice of its Department of Conservation and Recreation, which has calculated that a state need of $100 million exists every year to get sufficient money to farmers to provide cost share to those farmers who want to put good conservation practices on the ground. That's the overview of our budget asks. We'll talk about those specific programs in a bit more detail now. So what is the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund? What's it for? What is stormwater pollution? So this is a picture. Honestly, I'm not certain. I believe it's Richmond. Probably could be Alexandria, could be Washington. Indeed, it could be any of our older urban areas. And what characterizes this picture and our older and newer developed areas, the hallmark of development in our lifetimes, I think, is all of the impervious surface. Streets are paved, sidewalks are paved, roofs are hard. All of that paving prevents the actual functioning of a natural system of cleaning rain, and that is infiltration. You don't get infiltration through asphalt. What you get instead is rainwater hitting these surfaces, often heating up, often speeding up, and always, I'm going to say, always picking up pollutants from, you name it, dog litter, human litter, insecticides, fertilizers, antifreeze. The whole list is very long. And that noxious set of ingredients is racing now to our waterways. It's racing, it's picking up speed, it's picking up volume. And when it hits waterways, I'm going to show you a really terrible picture right now. It shocks me every time I see it. This is a picture of a tributary to Acatink Creek in Fairfax County. It was taken in 2012. It's a shocking picture, which frankly, many of you will have seen in other creeks and streams in your own neighborhoods. The picture is the result of years of polluted rainwater, polluted stormwater, racing out of storm drains, carrying pollutants, picking up speed, and then getting into the stream at a high velocity and high volume, and then scouring out the sides of the stream banks. Over years, this is the result. You have deeply incised stream beds and deeply scoured banks. It's ugly. It is the result of bad forces for our stream's health. It adds pollution to the already dirty water from the stream banks, and it's also unsafe. Now, obviously, Fairfax County regulators were aware of this, and what they did in 2012 was apply for in 2015, they applied for a grant from the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund to do a stream restoration project. Using the matching grant that they obtained, they did a stream restoration. And this is what we see. And this is as of 2017, a few years later. A lot of work was entailed in bringing about that almost miraculous transformation. Not all stream restorations are as successful as this, but many can be when the projects are well designed and well implemented and well maintained. This is a kind of textbook example of what SLAF monies can be used to achieve. Now, this is not the only kind of project that SLAF funds can be used for. The basic process is this. The Department of Environmental Quality has a list of criteria. Localities across the region will submit proposals for projects to address stormwater, and those projects are ranked by the Department of Environmental Quality according to a number of criteria, including currently the effectiveness of the proposed practice in reducing phosphorus from the waterway that's affected. Why phosphorus? Phosphorus is one of the two main nutrient pollutants that plagues the Chesapeake Bay and our local streams. So you want to get rid of it, and you want the projects that do a good job of that. That's great. We have found, however, that some regions and some projects are less susceptible to phosphorus reducing projects and are more likely to be successful in reducing nitrogen, another of the main nutrient pollutants to the bay. And so we are urging legislators to support legislation which will expand the criteria that DEQ ranks projects and to include not just phosphorus, but also nitrogen for those projects that seek to improve water quality through SLAF funds. We hope that you will see that there are benefits to that, and we will hopefully be able to talk with legislators about these benefits as well. That's not all we're asking for in this program. We've looked over the years in which this program has been in effect, and we've seen that there is a bit of a disparity between what some of the wealthier localities are able to attract by way of matching funds from these programs compared to less wealthy localities. And what we'd like to do through legislation is to enable DEQ to look at a locality that has fewer financial resources. I'm thinking of Portsmouth, for example. I could think of Richmond. Many of you will have your own favorite locality that is strapped for cash. We think that DEQ should have the flexibility to say, oh, that's a good project. I see it's coming from a locality that will have great difficulty in reaching a 50% match. So let's give it whatever the appropriate number is, maybe an 80% match for that project. That will enable a greater and I think more equitable distribution of state dollars across the Commonwealth so that poorer localities have a better chance of also being able to put on the ground good stormwater development projects. So moving away from stormwater for a moment, let's go to one of the other programs that we're asking legislators to support, and that is our cost share program. As I mentioned, this is one of the most cost-effective ways that we can restore our local waterways in the Bay. We can, using this program, help farmers put good practices on the ground. What you see here is one of the most effective practices. It's planting riparian buffers, treed and appropriately vegetated areas of land right along the edge of waterways. That strong growth tends to help keep the soil stabilized and on the land, out of the water. It tends to allow these plants, these trees, to take up the nutrients so that they support the trees and not pollute the waterways. And it provides a number of other benefits, including, frankly, wildlife habitat. It's a really important program. It helps farmers both do good things for water quality and in many cases supports their ability to have an economically thriving business operation. This picture, of course, is not so aesthetically pleasing in and of itself, but honestly, it's one of my favorite pictures. It's a picture of the wastewater treatment plant in Alexandria, run by Alexandria Renew. It's frankly a star in the pantheon of such facilities in Virginia. It's one of the most innovative plants in the Commonwealth, led by some really visionary leadership in our view. And it symbolizes what can be done with local resources, talented personnel, committed staffing, but also state funding to provide, again, matching grants. Some of the greatest successes in Virginia have been along our northern waterways, in particular along the Potomac River. The reason is that the Potomac River, you all know, opens up frankly, to the mid-Bay, the mid-Chesapeake Bay region. That's a region that has long been characterized as the most impacted by pollution. The pollution there has been so intense that dissolved oxygen is at its lowest level there. So we began our work there as a Commonwealth. Should congratulate ourselves for those efforts. And now I think recognize it's time to make the benefits of this program more available across the watershed, as particularly in the York River and the James River watersheds. We are asking legislators to recognize, if you will, the equitable advantages of continuing that work along our other river waterways so that all people get the same benefits, both at the local level, their local river watershed, and also to continue the work for bay restoration. At $55 million for this year, we like to say that's a bargain, although we understand dollars are limited. Now, I'm talking about dollars today. Frankly, it's the best day of the year to talk about dollars. Many of you may know and may have heard Governor Northam speak this morning to the Senate Finance Committee and the House Appropriations Committee. The governor does this every year in a prelude, if you will, to the beginning of a legislative session. The governor provides his recommendations as to what the best way of using state dollars are. We are in the middle of the state's budget biennium. In other words, halfway through a 2-year budget. And this is the time when the governor proposes amendments to that budget to the extent he thinks appropriate. He will give those proposed amendments to the General Assembly to consider when the General Assembly convenes in January. This morning, the governor spoke virtually, unlike in 2018, as depicted here when we were happy to host him at our Brock Center. This morning, the governor gave a summary of his understanding of where we are as a Commonwealth, significantly challenged, of course, by COVID impacts, direct and indirect. He provided a number of suggestions as to how the Commonwealth could better respond to those impacts. And we are grateful to him for recognizing that those are priorities. Happily, too, the governor gave us some ideas as to changes that he wishes to make to the biennial budget to benefit natural resources. And though we are still awaiting an opportunity to look at the details at a very high level, the governor told us that he will propose adding $12 million back into the state budget that supports the Department of Environmental Quality. I can't underscore from the Bay Foundation's perspective how important that proposal is. None of the programs of the Commonwealth to protect water quality could be effectively implemented without the guidance of the scientists and regulators and others at the Department of Environmental Quality. Unfortunately, for reasons that have to do with short state resources, the DEQ has been consistently underfunded in our view. So we certainly encourage legislators to support this proposal of the governor. I'd also just highlight as well, the governor has proposed adding more money to the existing budget for agricultural best management practices, which we talked about a moment ago. $13.5 million is a big addition. We would be grateful for it, as would our farmers, we are sure. It's certainly not the amount of money that we think is needed, but we are grateful to the governor for recognizing the importance of this program. Now I'm going to switch out of the topic of money and talk about something that's very dear to our hearts and important to the Commonwealth, and that is trees. Now, this picture we have posted here because it focuses on one of the, we think, clearest ways to look at the importance of trees in our landscape. It's a picture of some restoration work that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, community members, and others were spending the time putting a project of tree planting on the ground in Hopewell, Virginia. Why trees? Why Hopewell? What was that all about? Well, I'm going to start off at a point that was captured by some of our people thinking about trees, and that was a Science Museum of Virginia study recently that examined a number of different factors related to, I'm going to call it urban health, but they wouldn't probably have chosen those words. The study compared temperatures in urban areas, which are, relatively speaking, devoid of trees, have very small tree canopy, compared to the temperatures in the summertime in greener areas, whether other parts of the city or in suburban areas. And shockingly, although in some ways not surprisingly, the difference was huge, sometimes 16 degrees difference between the hotter portions without trees and those with trees. This is not insignificant, and it is not without effect. The study also correlated those heat island areas with the rate of hospitalizations for heat-related illnesses, highly correlated. And it also correlated those areas with historic records showing that many of these heat island areas were virtually the same as areas that had been formerly redlined. That is to say, systematically deprived of investment under now illegal racially based practices. So we have the confluence here in this picture, so to speak, of health, of trees, and equity. And we think it's provides an opportunity for us to look at how we can rectify some of these issues. First, let's talk about what trees produce. If you look at this picture, we're all immediately reminded about the enhancement to our aesthetic enjoyment, our quality of life. That's only the beginning. Trees are effective in slowing storm surges and in protecting against recurrent flooding in localized areas. They take up the water, hold it for a while, and then gradually release it once the flooding danger is past. Trees help clean the air of pollutants, particularly harmful particulates that are associated with higher rates of asthma and respiratory illnesses. People living in areas with trees are associated with greater physical activity and reduced rates, sometimes significant, of obesity. There is evidence in a variety of ways showing that there's higher and more profitable business activity in areas where there are trees and green canopies. There are studies showing that jobs are created in areas of cities where there are trees. The list of benefits of trees is very significant. I would just conclude with one last one that we're all recognizing addresses an existential problem, and that is greenhouse gases. Trees are the most fundamental, if you will, engines to take carbon dioxide out of the air and sequester it. So, with all of these benefits, shouldn't localities have a flexible hand in determining how to expand tree canopies? We think the answer is yes. And so we are supporting legislation this year that will enhance localities' ability to encourage greater and denser tree canopies in 4 specific areas. The first is to help the locality, if it chooses, to rely on trees to reduce pollution to waterways in order to meet its local stormwater permit. It's sometimes called an MS4 permit, municipal separate storm sewer permit, but it's a locality stormwater permit. Localities should be able to use trees as a cost-effective tool to do this. That's number 1. Number 2 is, I'd ask you all to think about our coastal regions east of 95, all of which are required to use good land use practices to keep, under the Chesapeake Preservation Act requirements. Yes, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act prevents development along the waterways, that 100-foot buffer area, but it also prescribes some land use practices for another part of those localities, what we call the resource management area. Developers can build in those areas, but we're suggesting in those secondary areas, the resource management areas, localities should be able to say, you need more trees to address some of the recurrent flooding that we see in those areas. That's number 2. Number 3 is specifically to address the historic negative legacies of redlining. If a locality is seeking to have redevelopment in a formerly redlined area, we think localities should be able to say, to have great flexibility in requiring expanded tree canopies in those areas to, again, mitigate some of those historic negative effects. Finally, we are saying that localities should have the ability to be flexible in expanding tree canopies to be consistent with the locality's comprehensive plan. I think you all are familiar with the comprehensive plan. All localities must have a plan which they renew every 5 years with the input of citizens. If that resulting comprehensive plan calls for broader tree areas, shouldn't localities be able to respond to citizens' voices? We think so. So this is the legislation we're supporting would not mandate localities do anything. It would just enhance their ability to be flexible with development. That's a really important goal of ours this legislative session. And we hope you will join your voices with ours to help us see that come to realization. Would also just like to draw your attention briefly to another piece of legislation we're interested in. This carbon sequestration bill would convene a task force of experts under the authority of the Secretary of Natural Resources and the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry. That task force would include some of our Commonwealth's top scientists from our research universities, regulators from our important environmental agencies, and involve stakeholders from a variety of contexts who would be looking at how to, if you will, harness natural systems, agriculture, silviculture, and others to sequester carbon and keep it from being released into the air. What the task force would direct is thinking about how do we measure this? What are the benchmarks? What are the baselines? Are there carbon markets nationally or even internationally that we could or should participate in? If so, what do we need to do to be ready for that? Are there ways that we can think about providing funding or generating funding for this kind of work? We all know, as I mentioned, this is an existential moment with respect to climate change. And from our perspective, giving the opportunity to Virginia to look at carbon sequestration is an important first step or an initial step in helping us to meet the challenges of the coming era. Now, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of priorities. and it would be challenging in any year. We have particular challenges this year. You may have heard that there will be new rules. Right now, it looks like, from my perspective, the session will not just be short as we normally understand it, 45 days. It will be very short, possibly 30 days. And that's an extraordinarily short period of time to get all the work done. That may change. We think there's some dialogue going back and forth between the houses and the parties, so we'll have to pay attention to that. There are, we understand, strict limits this year on the number of bills that each legislature can introduce. 7 on the House side, 12 on the Senate side. Again, compared to other years, very short. And we are very hopeful that some of the bills we've been talking about will make it to the floor. And certainly legislators have a lot of good ideas beyond the list that we've mentioned here. So we'll have to all be pretty nimble in seeing what actually gets to the floor. Finally, no surprise to anybody, we will be having a General Assembly session that is to a great extent virtual, as the special session was. The delegates, House of Delegates, will meet almost entirely virtually, though there may be some changes for committee meetings. The Senate, we expect to meet in the Science Museum in a socially distanced way. Legislators now have some experience in doing this. So I'm in no doubt that it will be able to be accomplished. One of the things that all of us will face, however, are challenges in reaching out to and connecting with our legislators. And so to talk about that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Ann Jerzyk. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. We've got some really good questions, and I'd like to go. I'm going to go ahead and run through those really quickly because they're pertinent. Let's see. The first one was from Bob Becklin, and this is particularly this is in reference to the wastewater treatment plant slide. And his question is, what percentage of the funding is already earmarked? In other words, he's trying to figure out how localities apply for, or wastewater treatment plants apply for and receive that funding.
So that's a really good question. And I will say that one of the best experiences I was able to watch and in a very small way to participate in was a set of stakeholder groups that met over the summer under the guidance of the Department of Environmental Quality. The purpose of those stakeholder groups was actually to decide how the next phase of pollution reductions from wastewaters should be allocated. And that means, in effect, which plants would need to be upgraded. So it was a very complicated process. I approached it from the lawyer regulator kind of perspective, but fortunately there were quite a few talented scientists and other technical specialists engaged in the process. The process entailed costs. It entailed availability of resources, determining what is already in process. And the effort is designed to be both to prescribe a set of steps that are both achievable and that are certain and that are consistent with the blueprint. You may know that the Governor Northam's administration issued about a year ago its Phase 3 watershed implementation plan designed to get us to the finish line for the blueprint. Part of that watershed implementation plan addressed the wastewater plants, and it set out some specific proposals, and it was examining the implementation of those proposals that DEQ was engaged in. So it's a long process, and it's not quite finished. A report has just been sent to the General Assembly with some of the findings, and a regulatory process has resulted in a proposed general permit, which would incorporate some of these steps. That's out for public comment in the very near term. So it's ongoing, it's multi-layered, and it's intended to meet the blueprint.
You'll also hear more from CBF about that particular set of comments when it's open for public comment. Sue Rigdon wants to know, what is the prospect of extending the Bay Act to areas west of I-95?
Another very good question. I think your question indicates you're aware that the administration and many regulators and stakeholders have been involved in looking at that question at a number of occasions, most recently last year. My own, to my knowledge, and actually relying on my personal crystal ball, I think the answer is I would be surprised if we see an effort that is legislative this year to extend the Bay Act requirements west of 95. Right now, the emphasis on the Bay Act at the regulatory side is to put in place a new set of regulations to implement what the General Assembly decided last January, and that is to allow localities when facing potential land development and land use in Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act areas to take climate change into account. Climate change is sea level rise, and also to rely explicitly on trees as a tool in addressing water quality and flooding. So that's a regulatory process that's happening right now. We will have more to say about that in next month. You may know that we will be putting on a webinar that will explore some of those proposals and our reaction to those proposals. Some of them at a very high level we think are good, and we have some suggestions for other aspects.
Right, that's January 12th, if you want to mark that on your calendar. The next question, and then we'll turn it over to my slides, because some of them have to do with sort of advocacy related, but the next question is from Rod Morgan. It's a two-part question. How does one define redlining for the purposes of legislation? In urban areas, there's a robust historical record. In rural marginalized communities such as Union Hill or Brown Grove, there is I think it's need for additional protections, but perhaps not an extant record of lending discrimination. And then a follow-up sort of second part to that is expanded environmental justice somewhere in the mix of priorities? And I think you've spoken to that a couple times.
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. Just to address briefly the first part of the question, we approached, as we started thinking about this idea, with kind of the same question: how do we capture? How could one capture the concept? All of what was included in redlining. What the legislative draft that I have seen captures is it references the records of a federal agency that directs, if you will, in the redline era, a definition of communities that should be in effect avoided for investment. So in other words, it's by reference to that federal document. I would say I personally can't tell you that is the only way that redlined areas can be identified. And my strong suspicion is that if people have a different and better definition, certainly we would want to hear about it, and would be very open to adding our voice to a broader definition if that's appropriate. So that's my first answer. The second one is, will environmental justice be part of the efforts that we've been talking about? And I will say, short answer, yes. Particularly, I made some comments about work to make the distribution of funds under the Stormwater Local Assistance Program more equitable, so that some communities, which are typically vulnerable communities as defined in our Environmental Justice Act, more likely to get an equitable piece of that pie. So that's one thing. The second is by specifically incorporating the concept of redlining as an area where tree expansion could occur. There are other steps that will be taken. I understand from legislation I'm hearing about on a more specific or differently focused environmental justice bent. One of them I'm hearing about is, I think it's a really interesting proposal that would task entities that seek the permits they need from DEQ to provide, along with their application for a permit, evidence that they have already and hopefully extensively advised the potentially impacted community about the proposal. Haven't seen any language, so I can't tell you that I think it's the right way of handling it or it's enough. But I will say, I think the idea is a good idea and it's likely to be a good first step. So those are the things I know about. I'm sure there's more. Happy to talk with you about any of those as we get closer to actually seeing the language in any legislation.
Thanks, Peggy. So I'm gonna go through just 2 or 3 slides that have to do with advocacy, because some of the questions in here, I'll just say, Marianne Moxon says, which legislators need a gentle push to fund CBF legislative priorities? That's a perfect segue to the next slide, Peggy, if you want to advance it.
Sure.
Yeah, so let's just say that we encourage you to first determine who your delegate and senator is, and then secondly, to look on their bio and find out what committees he or she sits on. The funding committees, the House Appropriations and Senate Finance, those are the folks who generally handle the purse strings. Most Bay-related bills come before House Ag, or on the Senate side, House Ag, Conservation, Natural Resources. The bills that have to do with giving authority to localities will come before county, cities, and towns, or local government. So it's very possible that that's where the tree bill that Peggy talked about will end up. We encourage you to find out exactly which committee your delegate and senator sits on. They could sit on multiple, not just one. And because that's going to help you prepare your communications with him or her. You want to advance, Peggy?
Yeah.
So normally what we do is we get folks together and we all go to Richmond and we have a great time, and we pull together these lobby for clean water days. We work with other watershed groups, and we host these on a regional basis so that you're with other like-minded individuals, and you all know exactly what bills you're talking about. You're going in as a group. But we can't do that this year. So we've got to get creative. What can we do? What should we do? Next slide. So I cannot overstress your importance in this process. Peggy and I are lobbyists, right? They see us coming. They sort of know what our agenda is. You're a constituent, and you're way more important than we are because you get to vote and we don't. So that's the very first thing you need to share with your legislator when you contact him or her. Hey, I live in your district. This is what I care about. We've listed some of the means of communicating with your elected officials here, but I'm going to open another poll up real quick, and let's just see. Let's just see. The question is, which of these advocacy actions have you taken before? And maybe you've responded to an action alert, maybe you've emailed your delegate or senator, maybe you've called them. This is multiple choice. If you've done all the above, I should have had that as an option. But I'll just say this: nothing can be more effective than placing a phone call or setting up a Zoom meeting with your delegate or senator. And the most important thing is to do it now. When they are considering legislation during General Assembly, when it starts on January 13th, as Peggy said, it's a short session. So they've got really 30 days to review and dispense with a lot of legislation. Right now, they've got a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit more mind energy that they can apply when they receive your correspondence. So I love the response that says, none of the above, but this will be the year. So thank you for that. Let me share these results. Yeah, so it looks like many of you have taken the opportunity to email your delegate or senator, and that's just, again, I can't stress how important that is. And I'll just share that before I joined CBF, I frankly had absolutely no idea how important the General Assembly was, right? I assumed that federal Clean Water Act laws were going to take care of everything. And it really wasn't until I got more deeply involved that I realized, well, wait a minute, Virginia is a Dillon rule state, so it has to grant authority to the localities before the locality can do just about anything. That's important, and that's how you can have direct impact on what legislation moves forward. Next slide, Peggy. So, all right, so when I say it's all about building relationships, you think about how, a neighbor moves in across the street and you're trying to figure out, is this somebody that I'm gonna, is gonna be my best friend in a few years? And so what do you do? And generally with a legislator, this is what I encourage everybody to do. And that is to just find some common ground. You can, once you look up who your legislator is, and the next slide will show you how to do that, then you can read their bios, you can figure out where they went to school. Maybe you also went to William and Mary. What church they go to. Maybe you're also Greek Orthodox or Presbyterian. Maybe they've got children who went to the same college that your kids did. But find something as a starting point, because legislators are people. We may disagree with them on policy, but they always deserve our respect. They're doing a tremendous service to us, and we need to be respectful. So remember, this is a short session, so now is a time to speak with them. And I would encourage all of you to use CBS legislative webpage as a reference. We will update it very soon. Right now it still refers to the 2020 legislative session. Next slide, Peggy. All right, so maybe you're a master wordsmith. So I'll just say that education comes in many forms. Legislators generally read letters to the editor. They generally do read the paper, but just in case they missed your letter to the editor, there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking scissors and clipping it out, pasting it on a piece of paper and mailing it to them, so that you make sure that they saw your, in case they missed it, you can make sure that they saw it. Next slide, Peggy. And finally, here are some online resources for you. So if you're, CBF is one of the members of the Virginia Conservation Network. And the reason I encourage you to go here to their bill tracker is because I expect that many of you are interested in a plethora of the environmental bills that will come before the General Assembly. So if you're interested in energy, climate change, land use, transportation, all of those bills are tracked on almost a day-by-day basis on VCN's bill tracker. The most important is finding out who your legislator is. That's how the second link is the Who's My Legislator. I encourage you to use that. It takes 2 seconds, type in your street address, and pop gives you who your state delegate and your senator are. You can click on the link that you get, and that will take you to their bio, and you can read what committees he or she sits on. And then lastly, if you're really into it, it's pretty interesting to hear the discussion during some of the committee meetings and to watch how your legislators vote on a particular issue, because afterwards you can say, yay, thank you so much for supporting that bill, or, ooh, I'm sort of disappointed that you took that position. But it's great that for you to hear their questions and also their responses to questions. So Peggy, I think that's my last slide. Yeah, there you go. And then we've got only 5 more minutes, so I'll let you cover this and then we'll go back to questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Anne, for providing what I think is a really great set of points for people who are interested in engaging with legislators. I would just say, add one thing to Anne's comments, and that is, this has been a really, for many of us, a very hard year. COVID, I need say no more about that. But for those who are interested in public policy, who are interested in environmental issues, who are interested in frankly, governance or politics, there's been a lot to be discouraged about this year. That is why I'm going to venture out on a limb here when I say this. That is why I encourage you all to do what Anne just said, and that is to watch legislators as they take action, make decisions, think about issues, discuss what's the right policy. Honestly, it's, to me, a really an opportunity every year for me to have my own optimism about the state of our nation recharged. These are committed citizens, committed statespeople who are trying to do the right thing from a variety of different perspectives. But it is really an encouraging thing. This coming year, 2021, it's going to be a year of a mixed emotions, I think. I'm sure I'm not alone in assuming that some of the more cantankerous aspects of the national political scene will take root here in Virginia. But that's because it's an election year. As you know, it's always an election year in Virginia. But this coming year, 2021, we will be electing a new governor. So far, among the declared candidates, we have those from, if you will, the middle of the political spectrum on both sides, and also from the extreme ends of the political spectrum. So you will be able to choose your favorite, the most approach that's most congenial to you. All the General Assembly seats are up for election, all the House members, all the senators. This will affect how our legislators consider bills. In good and bad ways. I don't need to explain to you how some of this could play out, but just keep that in mind. It matters from their perspective, what bills they put in and how they handle it, just as it matters to us. And finally, another really important event in Virginia's politics is happening this year. Voters across the Commonwealth supported an amendment to the Constitution to require a framework intended to ensure that the redistricting of our legislative districts will occur to the extent possible in a nonpartisan way. You might know that this was highly contested, that people on both sides of the aisle took very different positions, one from the other. Many people looking at the results are happy with what has happened. Many are not happy, but there will be a change. And citizens may sign up to be considered to be included in this redistricting commission. We can get you the link to do so if you think that you would be interested. But it's something you should watch, and it's a really, however it comes out, I think we can all say that Virginia, in enacting it, in trying to get rid of the politics in redistricting, has become a leader of the effort. And let's just all hope and work to make sure it comes out in a way that, for example, helps the priorities that we have, both for the environment, for social justice, for climate change. So just wanted to give you those final words. And honestly, I want to thank you for your attention and your interest in these matters and the work that you all do over the course of the year. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peggy. I'm going to answer one last question because I think it's relevant to what we're going to send. So Joy said, hey, I really enjoyed Peggy's presentation. Thank you so much, but bill numbers would be helpful. And as soon as those are available, we will absolutely both have that on our website, as well as to send out fact sheets that have the bill number printed on them. So thank you for asking that. Right now, they have not come out. So that's why we're not sharing that information with you right this second. So the second thing I'm going to send out, in addition to the slides, fact sheets about the bills that Peggy did talk about, and the link to the recording. I'll also send a letter that I would encourage you to share with your local elected officials, because the tree bill, for instance, will not get out of committee unless the localities ask for that additional authority. So you can send it to your board of supervisors, or your supervisor rather. You can send it to your city council member, copy your delegate and senator on the letter so that they know that you're interested in this. That's an opportunity to really hit many irons at the same time. So as Peggy said, thank you so much for joining us today. I've got that it's 1:01, so we went a minute over, but we really appreciate your time. And you'll be hearing from me shortly as soon as we get this back up on our website. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, bye-bye.